FAA and industry publications. Throughout this book, I've mentioned several aviation documents, including the Airport Facility Directory, AFD, the Aeronautical Information Manual, AIM, NOTAMs, and advisory circulars. These documents are all valuable sources of information that you need to help fly safely. Let's examine them again to ensure your familiarity with these valuable information sources. Additionally, we'll look at a few other sources of aviation information you might find useful. Airport Facility Directory. The Airport Facility Directory consists of several booklets, each covering different parts of the United States, as shown in Figure 20. Each directory contains detailed information on all public-use airports, including frequencies, runway information, services available, and much, much more. Issued once every 8 weeks, it's available on a subscription basis or as a one-time purchase. Each public airport, heliport, and seaplane base has an entry in the Airport Facility Directory. See Figure 21. Don't worry if you don't understand all this information. At the beginning of each AFD, a legend explains what each bit of data means. Believe me, there is ample information here to help you with almost all questions you may have about the airport and its facilities. In addition to airport information, the AFD also provides information on updates and changes to aeronautical charts. Since sectional charts are revised only once every 6 months, while the Airport Facility Directory is reissued every 8 weeks, any change to a sectional chart can be found in the Aeronautical Chart Bulletin in the rear of the AFD, Figure 22, Box A. Figure 22 shows all the additional information you'll find in the Airport Facility Directory. FAA, FSDO, Flight Standards District Office, and NWS telephone numbers, Box B, and a section for special notices, Box C, VOR receiver checkpoints, Box D, parachute jump areas, Box E, flight service station frequencies, Box F, and ARTCC frequencies, Box G. The AFD also contains information that's important for the IFR-rated pilot.
Hey Ryan, be careful what you shoot at. Things in here don't react too well to bullets. You can't help but pay attention to the rocket firing area notice east of Reno at the top of Figure 22, Box C. Of course, this area extends vertically up to, but not including 1,000 feet AGL. But you don't want to tempt anyone in charge of those rockets by flying a little lower than normal. If you don't think people become tempted, just think back to the time when you were at the driving range as a child. You saw that fellow in a steel cage tractor scooping up fallen golf balls. You probably thought, since he is protected, it probably won't hurt much if I did manage to hit the tractor. It's best to avoid any area with the word rocket in it.
The Aeronautical Information Manual. At the beginning of the chapter, I mentioned the Aeronautical Information Manual, AIM, shown in Figure 23. But it's hard to say too much about this encyclopedia of aviation information. It's your best guide to aviation information on the following topics: air navigation radio aids, aeronautical lighting and other airport visual aids, airspace, air traffic control, air traffic procedures, emergency procedures, safety of flight, medical facts for pilots, aeronautical charts and related publications, pilot controller glossary. Revised several times a year, This document is available on a subscription basis. It contains recommendations and procedures involving safety of flight and information that exists as regulations in other FAA publications. Notices to Airmen, NOTAMs. When there are significant and important changes in aeronautical information, you need to know about them. This becomes especially important when such information might affect the safety of your flight. NOTAMs contain information such as airport or primary runway closures, changes in the status of navigational aids, radar service availability, and other information essential to planned en route, terminal, or landing operations. When such information is not known far enough in advance to be included in the airport facility directory, it's likely to be found in the listing of NOTAMs. Your job is to check these NOTAMs before every flight. One way to obtain this information is to ask the flight service station specialist for all pertinent NOTAM information during your weather briefing. There are 3 types of NOTAMs you should be familiar with: NOTAM D, NOTAM L, and FDC NOTAMs. Let's examine all 3. NOTAM D. NOTAM D is information that is given distant D distribution from its generating source. In other words, any aviation information relating to and affecting IFR operations, in other words, approach light outages, navigation facilities, frequency changes, etc., is distributed via this distant NOTAM service. See Figure 24. NOTAM D can also be applicable to VFR flights as well. All this information is kept in computer in Kansas City and is distributed automatically via several sources. The flight service station has the capability of providing you with these NOTAMs during your weather briefing. Keep in mind that NOTAMs are published once every 2 weeks in the Notices to Airmen publication, NTAP, as shown in Figure 25. You may subscribe to these NOTAMs, or they might be available at your flight school. They're available at a flight service station if you happen to be near one. Once published, this NOTAM information isn't provided to you during your weather briefing. It's assumed that you have either subscribed to these NOTAMs or have the information you need, or that you have acquired the information from some other source. The problem is that some of these NOTAMs remain in effect for extended periods of time. For example, a VOR you want to use may be down for several weeks. If you don't subscribe to the published NOTAMs, most pilots don't, and you want to know about any published NOTAMs, you must specifically ask the flight service station specialist for them. NOTAM L. NOTAM L provides you with information on a local L level. This information consists of taxiway closures, personnel and equipment near or crossing runways, airport rotating beacon outages, and airport lighting aids that do not affect IFR operations, such as a VASI outage. You won't find NOTAM L information at flight service station locations beyond the local area. A separate file of NOTAM L information is maintained at each flight service station for facilities in their service area only. If you want the local NOTAMs for the area you'll visit, you must call the flight service station having responsibility for that area. Note: DUATS doesn't provide NOTAM L information. How do you know what their number is? Simply call the local flight service station on 800-WX-BRIEF, that's 1-800-WEATHER-BRIEF, and ask. These folks seem to be able to find everything. One of these days I'm going to call and ask if they have an alternate proof of Fermat's last theorem. The specialist will probably say, "Yeah, stand by, we're working on it now." Another way to identify the flight service station having jurisdiction over your destination airport is to look at the airport facility directory. Figure 26 shows that the NOTAM file for Hoopa Airport is located with the ACV or Arcata flight service station. Simply call them on the listed number. FDC NOTAMs. Occasionally, it becomes necessary to issue information on changes that are regulatory in nature. A regulatory change might be an amendment to an instrument chart used by IFR pilots, or the issuance of a temporary flight restriction, like prohibition of flight over a natural disaster area. When such an action is necessary, the National Flight Data Center, NFDC, will issue an FDC NOTAM, Figure 27. FDC NOTAMs are issued once and kept on file at the flight service station until published, like NOTAM-Ds, or cancelled. Flight service stations are responsible for maintaining a file of current, unpublished FDC NOTAMs concerning conditions within 400 miles of their facilities. FDC NOTAM information concerning conditions that are more than 400 miles from the flight service station or that are already published is given to a pilot only on request. During your weather briefing, make sure you also ask the flight service station specialist for any pertinent FDC NOTAM information concerning your flight. Advisory Circulars. For years, the FAA has been providing pilots with useful information in the form of advisory circulars, AC, Figure 28. Advisory circulars are a means of disseminating non-regulatory information of interest. The subjects covered include procedures, techniques, aircraft, airmen, airspace, ATC, airports, and general operating rules. Since these are advisory in nature only, their contents should not be considered legally binding unless they become regulations. You can order advisory circulars from the Superintendent of Documents, U.S. Government Printing Office, look in the white pages of the phone book under U.S. Government. You'll find that advisory circulars are numbered according to the Federal Aviation Regulation numbering system. For instance, the advisory circular in Figure 26 is numbered AC 61-67. The 60 represents information dealing with FAR Part 61, Certification Pilots and Flight Instructors. FAR Part 60 refers to airman licensing and certification. If the AC was numbered 90, this would represent information on air traffic and general operating flight rules. ACs marked 20 pertain to certification and testing of aircraft. FAR Part 23, for instance, deals with certification of small airplanes. ACs marked 70 pertain to airspace. FAR Part 71 deals with airspace construction. The Aviation Superhighway. There's the superhighway for automobiles and information. For pilots, I like to think of flying and its associated information stream as the superhighway. Books, books, and more books, not to mention pamphlets, magazines, videotapes, audio tapes, computer programs, aviation forums on the major online services, the Internet, including the World Wide Web. It sometimes seems that airplanes are supported by an information jet stream. There's so much to learn and so little time to fly. Every source of information makes its own unique contribution. You will eventually evolve your own combination of resources that works for you in terms of keeping up and having fun. On days when the weather doesn't cooperate or there isn't time to go flying, it can be entertaining to crank up a video or read a pilot publication and share the experiences and knowledge of others. Post-flight briefing number 17-1, Hand propping, a new way to give blood. The perils of hand propping, done improperly. Yes, people still hand prop aeroplanes. It is, however, risky business. Nevertheless, I believe you should be taught the basics of hand propping. Why? I know from experience that one day you might find yourself in a situation where you'll be tempted to try this on your own. Doing so without prior training is not very wise. Besides, even if you elect not to hand prop your aeroplane, basic instruction in the correct techniques will enhance your respect for the propeller. Find a qualified instructor who's experienced in hand propping aeroplanes. It is most encouraging if he still has all his limbs intact. Have that person show you the correct procedures, which include how to grip the propeller, the stance for best leverage and maximum safety, body movement, and communications with the person inside the cockpit. Perhaps the most important rule for hand propping is to have a competent pilot who's familiar with the aeroplane at the controls. Why? Once that engine starts, an aeroplane can move on its own and do a lot of damage. You don't want this to happen to you. There are several recorded cases of aeroplanes taking off without a pilot on board after being incorrectly hand-propped. Try explaining that to the owner of the flight school. Post-flight briefing number 17-2, Aviation Decision Making, Thoughts for Life. The fact is, not everyone on this planet exercises good judgment. For instance, every so often you'll read that someone in a black wetsuit, floating on a surfboard and dangling 4 limbs over the side, was attacked by a great white shark. Isn't that amazing? What was this person thinking? Doesn't dressing up this way make you look like the shark's favorite food, the seal? Is it the shark's fault he was served breakfast on board? You could say the surfer sealed his own fate in opting to dress as he did. Clearly a bad decision. Fortunately, exercising good judgment is something we can do on the ground or in the air. With a few simple tools, you can keep yourself from being eaten by some of aviation's well-known predators. It's true, the exercise of good judgment can be taught, despite a one-time popular belief that good judgment only came with years of experience. We now know that you can learn to identify and control several of the variables leading to poor decisions. For instance, it's possible to identify attitudes that are hazardous to safe flight, as well as learn how to modify our personal behavior. These are just a few of the useful techniques that help you make better decisions. Let's cover a few of the most important features of aviation decision-making. 2 types of decisions. Decisions usually fall into 2 categories, those tied to time constraints and those that are not. A time-constrained decision often requires an immediate solution. For example, if you have an engine fire, this requires immediate action. If, on the other hand, your alternator just failed in VFR conditions, you need not rush to solve this problem. You can take your time and collect information before deciding on a course of action. In fact, most of the aviation decisions you'll make will not require immediate action. Pre-flight is a good example. It's rare to hear of someone having an emergency when pre-flighting the airplane. You can take your time and carefully consider all the information available to you. That's what makes the results of a NASA study all the more interesting. The research revealed that 80% of the poor decisions leading to an in-flight incident occurred during the pre-flight phase, when pilots had all the time in the world to get it right.
Now, folks, fuel exhaustion is a good example of this type of error. If a pilot had taken more time to carefully think about fuel, he or she wouldn't have crashed short of the destination with bone-dry tanks. In case you're interested, one study found that 50% of fuel exhaustion accidents occurred within 10 miles of the destination airport, and 70% occurred within 1 mile of the airport. Close. So close, yet so far.
Of course, pilots could handle this problem by planning a flight, then switching the destination to an airport that's 10 miles closer. You're right, that seems ridiculous, doesn't it? I think it's much simpler to do some proper pre-flighting to begin with. Thoughtful preparation, having sufficient fuel reserves, and careful planning are the ways to prevent accidents. Factors that influence our decisions. Knowledge. There are several factors that influence your ability to make good aviation decisions. First, in order to successfully cope with any aviation situation, you need knowledge. This is typically acquired during flight training, where you'll learn things like how to calculate airplane performance, evaluating weather, and selecting alternatives if the flight can't be completed as planned. These are just a few of the many practical topics you'll be exposed to during the course of your training. I said practical topics, so don't expect to learn something like how to look good in scarf and goggles. Skill. In addition to knowledge, you must develop skill in applying that knowledge. That's why the FAA requires a minimum of 40 hours of flight training for the private pilot license. This also explains why you can't obtain a pilot's license via a home correspondence course. If you could, it would properly be called a crash course. In addition to this, a practical flight test as well as written test must be passed in order to demonstrate your flight and knowledge skills. Understanding how to make decisions effectively. There are several aids available to help you make decisions properly. A checklist is a good example of one of these aids. Written type checklists are normally used for repetitive tasks when it's not wise to rely on short or long-term memory. Checklists are commonly used for the pre-flight inspection of the airplane, starting the engine, emergencies, and engine shutdown. Checklists can also be used during the pre-flight phase, and these don't necessarily need to be of the written variety either. A simple acronym is often sufficient to cover the essentials. For instance, before every flight, you should take inventory of your psychological and physiological readiness to pilot an airplane. You can use the acronym I'm SAFE to do this. Here's what the acronym means. 1. I. Illness. Do I have any symptoms? 2. M. Medication. Have I been taking prescription or over-the-counter drugs? 3. S. Stress. Am I under psychological pressure from work or home situations? Do I have money, health, or family problems? 4. A. Alcohol. Have I been drinking within 8 hours or within 24 hours? 5. F. Fatigue. Am I tired and not adequately rested? 6. E. Eating. Have I eaten enough of the proper foods to keep adequately nourished during the entire flight? Pilots using this checklist are less likely to suffer some sort of impairment that often leads, or at least contributes, to an accident. Statistics show that impairment contributes to many more accidents than mechanical problems. Please commit this checklist to memory and use it before every flight. Self-awareness and hazardous thinking. Common behavioral pilot traps. If there is such a thing as an enemy to a pilot, then it's the pilot himself or herself. It's a pilot's inability to deal with some very common behavioral traps that usually gets him or her into trouble. You don't want to fall into these traps. I'm specifically referring to traps like always trying to complete the flight the way you planned it, trying to please your passengers, trying to meet schedules, as well as trying to demonstrate that you have the right stuff. Well, at hundreds of miles per hour, the fabled right stuff can turn you and your airplane into bent stuff. Here are 12 common traps of which you should be aware. Most experienced pilots have fallen into one or more of these somewhere along the way. If they were lucky, they escaped unscathed and learned from the experience. Here's your chance to learn before the experience. Avoiding these traps requires recognizing the behaviors or tendencies associated with them. 1. Peer pressure. No, this doesn't have anything to do with flying near the beach. It's simply poor decision-making based upon emotional response to peers rather than evaluating a situation objectively. 2. Mindset. This trap results from a pilot's inability to recognize and cope with situations that differ from those anticipated or planned. In other words, things change. When necessary, pilots should as well. 3. Get-there-itis. This tendency, common among pilots, clouds the vision and impairs judgment. It's caused by a fixation on the original goal or destination combined with a total disregard for any alternative course of action. Get-there-itis is suspected to be the root cause of another malady that I just made up, called break and crumple your aeroplane-itis. 4. Duck under syndrome. This is a tendency instrument-rated pilots have to sneak a peek by descending below minimum altitudes during an instrument approach. It's based on a belief that there is always a built-in fudge factor that can be used, or on an unwillingness to admit defeat and shoot a missed approach. Pilots from China might call this the peeking duck under glass syndrome. 5. Scud running. This can be dangerous. Scud running involves pushing the capabilities of the pilot and the aircraft to and beyond the limits by trying to maintain visual contact with the terrain, while trying to avoid physical contact with it as well.
Continuing visual flight rules, VFR, into instrument conditions. This often leads to spatial disorientation or collision with the ground and/or obstacles. It is even more dangerous if the pilot is not instrument qualified. And it's especially dangerous if the pilot isn't wrapped in a big, thick mattress too. Bugger the mattress, it's still gonna hurt.
7. Getting behind the aircraft. The only time it's good to get behind the aircraft is when you untie the tail before departure. Unfortunately, some pilots allow events or the situation to control their actions rather than the other way around. This condition is characterized by a constant state of surprise at what happens next. Pilots in this condition often look like they drew their eyebrows in at too great an angle during makeup time. 8. Loss of positional or situational awareness. Another case of getting behind the aircraft, which results in not knowing where you are, an inability to recognize deteriorating circumstances, and/or the misjudging of how fast your situation is worsening. 9. Operating without adequate fuel reserves. Ignoring minimum fuel reserve requirements, either VFR or Instrument Flight Rules IFR, is generally the result of overconfidence, lack of flight planning, or ignoring the regulations. In other words, you can fuel some of the people some of the time, but you can't fuel everyone all the time, especially when they need to be fueled. 10. Descent below the minimum en route altitude. Here, the duck under syndrome, discussed earlier, manifests itself during the en route portion of an IFR flight. 11. Flying outside the envelope. This occurs from a pilot's unjustified reliance on the usually mistaken belief that the aircraft's high-performance capability meets the demands imposed by his or her, usually overestimated, flying skills. 12. Neglect of flight planning. Pre-flight inspections, checklists, etc. This is a problem associated with a pilot's unjustified reliance on his or her short and long-term memory, regular flying skills, repetitive and familiar routes, etc. Hazardous thought patterns and their antidotes. Another factor affecting the quality and safety of flight is a pilot's attitude. Unlike personality, most psychologists agree that you can change an attitude. Your attitude is a state of mind, a feeling, a disposition. Not all attitudes, unfortunately, are conducive to safe flying. The following are 5 attitudes that aviation psychologists believe to be particularly hazardous to safe flight. Anti-authority. This attitude belongs to people who don't like being told what to do. Folks like these often rebel against the rules and regulations on which safe flying are built. This hazardous attitude causes some pilots to rebel against authority by deliberately breaking rules intended for safety. For instance, I knew of a private pilot who removed the right seat from his aeroplane, so there would be no place for an instructor to sit and tell him what to do. It's a good bet that he had the North American distributorship on anti-authority attitudes. Impulsivity. Some people often feel the need to do something and do it immediately, even when it's not the right thing to do. Often these folks will do the first thing that comes to mind, without thinking about what the best alternative might be. This is why I always get a little nervous when a pilot I'm flying with suddenly says, "Hey, watch this." It's likely that he's about to engage in some strange behavior that he probably hasn't thought about very carefully. Having a front row seat at Aviation Impulsive Theater is not my idea of having a good time. Invulnerability. It's not uncommon for people to feel that accidents only happen to others, not to them. These folks know that accidents can happen, and they know that anyone can be affected, but they never really feel or believe they will be personally involved. A pilot with this attitude is more likely to take chances and increase risk. Pilots like this often think they're Superman, but Superman doesn't really need an airplane, does he? Macho. A pilot who is always trying to prove that he or she is better than anyone often thinks, "I can do it, I'll show them." Most pilots are susceptible to this hazardous attitude, which can lead to taking risks to impress others. This is why it's best not to fly with any pilot who says something like, "Float like a butterfly, swoop like a bee. That's why all the other pilots want to fly like me." Resignation. Pilots who think, "What's the use?" are people who don't feel in control of the events in their lives. They often blame bad luck for whatever happens. They tend to not seek information and to not make positive decisions. Instead, they drift along hoping that good things happen, while doing little or nothing to ensure that they do. It's as if they fold their hands and sit back passively, doing nothing, like a little pilot Gandhi. While that behavior may liberate a country from the clutches of foreign domination, it's not likely to make you any safer in the air.
Bobby, it looks like I'm going to have to lecture you all afternoon. Bobby, these attitudes can contribute to poor judgment. They can compel you to make decisions involving greater risk. Once you've recognized them, however, you've taken the first step in neutralizing their dangerous effect on your decision-making process. Remember, most people still have these attitudes to some degree. To be frank about it, all of us, at one time or another, have probably acted macho, impulsive, or invulnerable. Avoiding problems with judgment means that you should be aware of how these attitudes can negatively influence flying safely.
The figure on page Q25 shows the commonly applied antidotes used to counter hazardous attitudes. If through your process of self-monitoring and evaluation, you catch yourself exhibiting one of the hazardous thought patterns, then swallow the appropriate antidote as quickly as possible. Final thoughts on thoughts. Here's something else I want you to consider. It's possible that the very qualities that make pilots good are the same ones that can injure them. There seems to be a thin line between positive personality traits for aviators and an extension of those same traits that lead to hazardous thinking. For example, wimpy pilots aren't safe pilots. Neither are macho pilots. A certain degree of self-confidence and assertiveness is necessary to fly an airplane, so these personality traits are overrepresented in the pilot population. They are useful up to a point. There is, however, a very thin line between these traits being productive and counterproductive. Confidence is good, cockiness is not, and it's not a long distance between the two. You may be sitting there thinking, only wackos would do such dumb things in an airplane. I'm a safe pilot and wouldn't dream of doing such nonsense. Yet, the macho attitude is nothing more than an extension of this same thought. I don't know where the dividing line is between the two, but I think you do. At least you have the best chance of figuring out where that line is. Given that pilots may have personality characteristics that can evolve into some forms of hazardous thinking, it makes sense that they should frequently monitor their attitudes for signs of this behavior. The moment an attitude is detected that's a counterproductive extension of a normal, safe mode of thinking, they should apply one or more of the appropriate hazardous thought antidotes. Said another way, if pilots don't modify their behavior when necessary, Mother Nature will. Finally, be aware that almost all aviation accidents are caused by human error. Pilots can do something to prevent accidents. They are not subject to the vicissitudes of luck or poor maintenance. Safe flying is within the control of every pilot. Fate is not the hunter.
Hello, this is Rod Machado. I'm glad you were able to join me for this tour of the aviation wonderland. May all your skies be blue and all your flying hours as safe, interesting, and as exciting as mine have been.